Yes, my microphone is indeed attached to a knife, and I am unsettlingly close to the camera, but this is what I've got to work with right now, so my apologies. It is at least kind of novel, right? Knife microphone. So anyway, one of the most successful clips ever from the conspiracy theory show InfoWars, hosted by the now bankrupt Alex Jones, involves Jones going on a ridiculous rant where he claims that nefarious actors are putting chemicals into the water to make frogs gay.
I don't like them putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay. Do you understand that? Serious crap.
Jones concocts this idea by referencing a couple of things that have actually happened. Most important among them, he singles out a common herbicide called atrazine, which really does cause hormone imbalances that can result in some pretty drastic physiological and behavioral changes in male frogs. So, Jones takes an example of a real, actually existing problem, which is a corporation, in its pursuit of never-ending profit, aggressively marketing a controversial herbicide that, as he puts it, turns the frogs gay. And he turns this into a far-reaching conspiracy theory, a secret shadowy agenda to turn frogs, and of course by extension people, gay, by pumping this herbicide into water. The reality is unfortunately a lot less awesome though. Truth is, there's just that a chemical company was left unchecked, and thus was able to freely spread a very questionable herbicide far and wide, predictably resulting in ecological side effects. The frog hormone imbalance thing actually seems like not that big of a deal at all, when compared to a lot of the other, actually nasty stuff that this herbicide is alleged to do. To put all this in simple terms, this is caused by, well, capitalism, particularly its less regulated forms. But Alex Jones is not against capitalism, obviously. So, Jones's insane conspiracy theory, aside from its very clear and obvious primary goal of just making him money by scaring his viewers into buying the water purification products that he has for sale on his website, also serves to divert their attention away from capitalism. He whips them into a homophobic frenzy, keeps them focused on the culture war, and in doing so, he ensures that they'll never even get close to putting two and two together and figuring out that the actual root of this problem is simply economic and systemic. In fact, it's caused by the very same economics and the very same system that Jones likes. He does this by ignoring the most basic and obvious possible explanation, that this company is simply trying to make as much profit as possible, and just so happens to be causing issues for others along the way that they're indifferent to. Jones instead posits that they're actually specifically driven by this desire to turn the frogs gay, like that's the actual end goal here. And the marketing and incredibly widespread use of that product as an actual herbicide is painted as some sort of elaborate ruse to cover for the real agenda of the gaying of the frogs. And this is also, of course, implied to be sort of a test run for a broader implementation of water poisoning to turn humans gay. Obviously, right? What are you, dumb or something? That didn't occur to you? This sort of logic is emblematic of some of the most popular and damaging right-wing conspiracy theories of the modern era, which have been spreading farther and wider than ever before, thanks to the internet and social media. They often take a real problem and then create elaborate, nonsensical narratives that divert attention away from its actual causes, the systemic and economic problems that are at its root. Attention is thus diverted away from the real reasons that these problems even exist in the first place, and often towards vulnerable minority groups who are easy targets for right-wing culture war outrage. Such conspiracy theories thus ultimately serve to uphold the status quo, and especially the economic status quo, to get people thinking, for example, that the problem with immense corporate power that results in exactly the scenario with the herbicide that we just went over is not so much the corporate power itself, but rather just that it's held by some select, bad corporations. And the reason they're bad, of course, has nothing to do with the system itself. It's rather just because on a sort of individual level, they're out to spread the woke agenda or whatever. In this video, we're going to be going over a couple more of these conspiracy theories, breaking them down just like we did the gay frogs one, and explain how to more effectively combat them by actually addressing the root causes themselves. The overall point being that one of the big reasons why these conspiracy theories have been able to spread so far and wide so rapidly is because liberals, meaning in the context of this video, people and politicians who uphold liberal capitalism, while generally, at least in the first world, being somewhat socially progressive, are unable to actually acknowledge the root political and economic problems and provide more grounded explanations for them, as I just did. Because, well, they like capitalism, they're largely okay with the dominant system, and the status quo in general. So when they come across one of these conspiracy theories, they have no real interest in acknowledging, let alone tackling, the real economic issues that they actually stem from. And they're certainly not going to be providing a rational alternative explanation for why such issues exist. All they can really do, and this is exactly what they tend to do, is just sort of laugh about how the conspiracy theories are ridiculous. Which, yeah, they are. But just pointing out that they're ridiculous and little else isn't really providing any alternatives to their audiences and their potential audiences. And that's why liberals can't counter conspiracy theories. You see that? I said the title of the video. Please clap. Before continuing, I'd like to thank the sponsor of this video, Atlas VPN. Now, I'm originally from Australia, but I live in Argentina, two places that are pretty far away if you didn't know. And I sometimes try to access Australian content online, only to find that it's region blocked. For example, the Australian public broadcaster SBS has an extensive library of movies available to stream for free on their SBS On Demand website. But here's what happens if I try to watch them from Argentina. I can't. Region blocked. Terrible, right? Well, luckily, all is not lost. Atlas VPN can fix this problem with just the click of a button. All I have to do is search for an Australian server in the app, click it, and within seconds, I'm able to stream any movie they have on there just as if I were actually in Australia while I'm on the other side of the world. If you want to do the same for whatever region block is preventing you from accessing the content that you want to watch, or also for other things like keeping your Google searches private or blocking ads and malware, Atlas VPN is the perfect solution. Especially since with just one single subscription, you can install it and use it on an unlimited number of devices. Atlas VPN currently has a summer deal going on. You can get a free year-long Atlas VPN premium subscription for just $1.83 per month, with 3 months extra thrown in for free, and with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Take advantage, protect your privacy, and get all of the benefits of Atlas VPN for this extremely low price. Head down to the description of this video and click the link there to get your hands on this deal. Thanks again to Atlas VPN for their sponsorship of this video, and now let's get right back to it. So now let's move on to one of our other examples. One of the most dangerous and widespread conspiracy theories in the US today is known as QAnon. To summarize it very succinctly, QAnon is based around this anonymous guy who calls himself Q, hence the QAnon name, who posts these ridiculous, cryptic predictions online that imply things like, tomorrow, Donald Trump is totally gonna arrest all of his political opponents. Trust me, guys. None of what he posts has ever come true, yet somehow hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, still somehow believe that this Q guy is some sort of insider who's blowing the lid off a vast conspiracy. QAnoners, as the conspiracy's adherents are often called, though I honestly don't care enough to check if they actually call themselves that, believe, based on posts by this Q, that former Republican Party US President Donald Trump was, or perhaps even still is, the savior of the USA. According to them, he's gonna fix absolutely everything that's wrong with the country, and he's gonna do it by destroying the opposition Democratic Party and liberal progressives in general, who, according to them, secretly run everything from behind the scenes via their control of the deep state, a shadowy, unaccountable, and powerful group of people within the US state. And also, and this is very, very important for QAnon, the Democrats and liberals of this deep state run a secret child trafficking ring where they apparently harvest kids' blood for satanic rituals and also eat said kids, which is apparently supposed to be like their ultimate motivation for everything else they do. Because why not, I guess? QAnoners have a particular disdain for Donald Trump's 2016 election opponent, Hillary Clinton, and believe that basically any prominent public figure who is at all aligned with the Democratic Party is a part of this conspiracy. Now, QAnon is obviously ridiculous and insane, and its believers have some serious issues to say the least. But one of the reasons why it was able to grow so much so fast is because of the inability of the same liberals who the conspiracy theory largely targets to effectively counter the core assumptions that underlay it. They can't provide rational alternative explanations for the real problems that QAnon latches onto, and then provides its own insane explanations for. For example, the whole elite child trafficking ring thing that QAnon is reliant upon is actually somewhat based in reality. The entire Jeffrey Epstein affair, where said rich financier ran a private island where children were really trafficked to really be abused by America's political and economic elite, makes that very clear. The thing is, though, it wasn't just the Clintons and other targets of QAnon who had compromising ties to Epstein. Donald Trump, their own Jesus Christ-like figure, did too. In fact, I would argue that his ties to Epstein are even more compromising than those of the Clintons. He even once called Epstein a terrific guy. This, of course, makes perfect sense in the context of a rather basic, logical, systemic critique. The US has one of the most deeply entrenched two-party systems in the entire world, with both parties very well known for their primary commitment of protecting the interests of the economic elite, to only marginally differing degrees. Bill and Hillary Clinton have spent most of their lives being the top-level representatives of these very same elites. And Donald Trump, a billionaire, is one of said elites. The Clintons have spent most of their lives serving people like him. So that they frequented the same circles and all have similar connections to some nefarious figure like Epstein, whose whole job was to facilitate the depraved, disgusting, and abusive habits of them and people like them, is hardly surprising. The average liberal can't quite acknowledge these truths though, because for one, they're unlikely to be willing to concede that the economic interests of such a vile right-wing capitalist like Donald Trump are so neatly aligned with those of the rest of the capitalist class, including the supposed good capitalists who are liberal Democrats. Because for them, the system itself isn't the problem. The problem is instead just that there are bad actors within it. Quite similar to what Alex Jones sort of implies with his conspiracy theory that we went over earlier. So there are good billionaires, like the tech billionaires, who tend to be more likely to back the Democratic Party, and there are bad ones, like the orange man, Donald Trump. Thus, for them, the issue isn't that the system allows someone like Donald Trump and every other big capitalist to exist in the first place, but rather just that Trump is sort of individually a bad guy for reasons largely unrelated to his class position. So, liberals are unwilling to critique capitalism, which really needs to be done in order to accurately explain why something like the Epstein child trafficking ring existed in the first place. The concentration of wealth in the hands of capitalists, which makes them and the politicians who they deputize to advocate for their interests practically untouchable, and thus able to do pretty much whatever they want, no matter how depraved it may be. The Liberals' inability to point to this very obvious root cause greatly hampers their ability to counter QAnon's exaggerations and its conspirational explanations for why things like this happen. And for two, Donald Trump was good friends with the Clintons for decades, and he was a big-time donor to the Democratic Party. They even remained friends all the way up to Donald Trump's 2016 presidential run. Trump's old pal Bill even encouraged him to run for president in a 2015 phone call, which I think Bill may have come to regret since. Until Trump's own personal ambition to become president put him on a collision course with that exact same ambition of Hillary Clinton, the families quite liked one another, and that makes perfect sense. Trump was an incredibly wealthy businessman, and the Clintons were two of the world's most prominent representatives of incredibly wealthy businessmen. Why wouldn't they get along? Liberals, of course, can never acknowledge something like that, because to them, the Clintons are like superheroes, and Trump is their arch nemesis. The notion that their most important interests have actually always been fundamentally quite aligned is, for the liberal, taboo, explaining that the Clintons, who are basically like Satan for QAnoners, were actually great pals with Donald Trump, who QAnoners tend to paint as like some sort of Jesus Christ figure, and that all of them have very similar ties to an actually existing child abuse ring, is a very good way to dismantle QAnon's entire narrative. But liberals can't do that, because to them, Hillary and Bill Clinton are the good guys and Donald Trump is the bad guy. The suggestion that the Clintons or other mainstream Democratic Party or liberal politicians have spent most of their lives serving the interests of people just like Donald Trump, true as it may be, wouldn't exactly be well received by the average liberal. And all of this has its roots in the exact same problem. Liberals are unable to critique the economic system itself, most political systems themselves, etc., because, well, it is their economic system, it is their political system. And they're also certainly not going to be acknowledging the class conflict that is inherent to these systems anytime soon. They thus deny themselves the ability to point out the common interest between the two groups that QAnon likes to pretend are mortal enemies, which is a very powerful angle of attack against it. This is also a good angle to use against Trump's MAGA movement in general, because, well, it's often difficult to tell exactly where Trump's mainstream MAGA movement and QAnon begins and ends. Because while their claims about the specific people who they cast as their enemies tend to differ a bit, the enemies are pretty much the same. The perceptions of the Clintons, of liberals, and of the Democratic Party as satanic enemies of the glorious hero Donald Trump is shared between both. But as we just went over, the economic interests who these two sides both largely represent are the same. Hence why Trump supporters, along with many other Republicans, tend to focus much more on demonizing minorities, such as with their very prevalent anti-LGBT panic narratives. And the Democrats have really been mostly happy to oblige them, focusing on pushing the exact opposite position, which is obviously the correct one, while being quite happy to still do relatively little to differentiate themselves economically. As long as they can keep people focused on everything but the economic system that is at the actual root of everyone's problems, as long as one side is kept frothing at the mouth about, say, the existence of LGBT people, while the other side is kept desperately trying to defend their basic rights, the wealthy elites who wield the real power are going to be just fine, and nothing will ever really be solved for good. They don't particularly care if you buy from the pro-LGBT company or from the anti-LGBT company, as long as you're buying, and as long as those markets remain free enough for them to exploit. Let's move on now to our other example, the white genocide conspiracy theory. This is common in far-right circles in the West, and has even been peddled in the mainstream media, particularly by Tucker Carlson on Fox News. This conspiracy theory posits that the migration of people considered by its adherents to be non-white to countries that they regard as racially white countries is a planned and intentional act of genocide against white people, which is usually claimed to be directed and carried out by some sort of shadowy global Jewish cabal, is to gradually alter the racial demographics of these countries with more and more non-white immigrants until the people that they consider to be white become a minority. What exactly the groups who they claim are doing this would actually gain from doing it tends to be very unsatisfactorily explained. I could go on for a long time about the very obvious racism at the root of this, and I have another video about the origins of racism itself, which might give you some insight on that topic if you're interested. But I want to stick with the theme here, and instead hone in on another root factor that this conspiracy theory latches onto: the very real economic problems that result in the very real problem of migration from poorer countries to rich ones. Though such migration is actually a problem for those poorer countries and their people, rather than for the rich ones that the white genocide conspiracy theory laughably frames as their victims. Liberals tend to attack this conspiracy theory and others like it by focusing on debunking the racism that is inherent to it and celebrating the contributions of migrants to these rich first world countries. These are clearly important things to talk about, but their liberal ideology also happens to cloud their ability to explain something that's extremely important to it: why this migration happens in the first place. Let's use the USA again as the prime example here. Most, but not all, anti-immigrant sentiment in the US is directed at irregular migration across its southern border, where people predominantly from Mexico and Central America, but also from many other places, cross in search of a better life in the USA. Millions upon millions upon millions of people have decided that the situation in their home countries is so bad, the opportunities for them there so near inexistent, that they'd be better off leaving them to take an incredibly long, arduous, and very dangerous journey to the USA, a trip that they have a very real chance of dying on, to live undocumented, and without the basic rights that documentation affords, like basic worker protections, and the ability to ever actually go back and visit their families in their home countries, since if you're an irregular migrant, obviously it's very difficult for you to get back into the USA after leaving, and all with the very real risk of their lives potentially being destroyed at any moment if they get arrested and deported. These are extremely drastic measures for someone to choose to take. No one is going to leave their family, their neighborhood, everything and everyone they've grown up with and know, and do such a thing unless they truly believe that things are so bad at home that such a colossal attempt to change their life comes with enough potential benefit to be worth the massive risk. So we have to ask then, why is it that things are, for the average person, so much worse in their home countries and so much better in the USA, even despite the fact that the USA is quite well known for having a relatively low median standard of living compared to other wealthy countries? The answer is very simple. Imperialism. The US has a long and ongoing history of imperial interference in Latin America, and the countries closest to it, which are precisely the ones where most of these migrants come from, have been some of its worst victims. The US has invaded these countries, couped their governments, interfered in their politics, backed fascist dictatorships there, and more. Basically, they've done everything that they possibly can to ensure that as much of the wealth as possible from these countries flows to the USA, rather than to the people who actually live there. This has also been heavily compounded in recent decades by the USA's disastrous exportation of its war on drugs. The illegal drug industry responded to this crackdown by itself becoming heavily militarized and much more violent. Combined with the huge demand for narcotics in the USA, and the fact that these countries have the horrid luck of being right there along the transportation routes to get the narcotics to the US, this has rendered huge parts of these countries to be not just stuck in poverty, but also incredibly dangerous, far more than they were before. And that's saying a lot, since many weren't exactly safe places before either. When hundreds of millions of people find themselves in a situation like that, it's logical and expected that many of them would decide to take their chances and head for a richer country. And in this case, not just any rich country, but specifically the rich country that has played a huge part in keeping them in poverty in the first place, and that has looted a lot of their country's wealth in doing so. The racists who believe in the white genocide conspiracy theory obviously aren't against their countries imperializing others, and especially not other countries that they view as being non-white. So partly to distract from the real reasons for why this happens by positing a completely ridiculous alternative explanation, and partly because they're just generic Nazi-style racists, they latched onto the tried and tested trope of a global Jewish conspiracy, which in this case, they claim somehow incentivizes these migrants to travel to the USA not to seek a better life or anything like that, but rather for the explicit purpose of diluting their supposedly white gene pool. Obviously, that's insane. It's rather just simple material interests. Things have been kept so bad for these migrants at home that traveling to the US at very great personal risk to probably end up having to work some really shitty job in very precarious circumstances legitimately seems appealing to them in comparison. It's not a good thing or a desirable thing that so many people feel compelled to leave their home countries to go and be exploited for cheap labor by capitalists in another country. It's not something to celebrate, as liberals often nauseatingly do in response to right-wing anti-immigration rhetoric. The ideal would instead be that these countries were not poor, and thus significantly better places to live, ensuring that any migration would be entirely voluntary, spurred by things like personal preferences rather than desperation. Liberals, however, don't like to acknowledge the real causes of this migration. Similar to the white supremacists, they're interested in obfuscating the imperialism of Western countries, as they tend to love them and uphold them as their most shining examples. So they outright deny that this imperialism even exists, and often even instead frame it as being like mutually beneficial, rather than exploitative or damaging in any way, shape or form. For them, this kind of desperate migration happens because Western countries are just sort of superior, and the circumstances in these poorer countries somehow has absolutely nothing to do with centuries of Western colonialism and imperialism, and certainly not with continued Western aggression and their continued exploitation today. This is, ironically, quite similar to what white supremacists tend to believe. Because of this, liberals can't, and really don't want to, deal with the white genocide conspiracy theory at one of its most important roots. The best that they can do is to focus on how good the migration actually is for the first world countries that receive it. And yeah, it is good for them. It helps them to counteract the low birth rates that tend to come with higher living standards, for example. And it gives their capitalists a constant source of precarious labor, helping them to find candidates for the low-paying, less desirable jobs that the native population tends to be less willing to do or less willing to take low pay for. And when it comes to actual, more regular, legal migrants who tend to have things like university educations, the receiving country benefits even more. They pay absolutely nothing for the many years of their education, but end up getting the benefit of their expertise, while their origin country loses it. But you can abstract migrants into little more than numbers and statistics all you want. You can talk all you want about how awesome your country is and how that's why it supposedly attracts them. But at the end of the day, you're still doing very little to get to one of the most important problems at the root of this conspiracy, which is why those people are leaving their countries in the first place. One of the big purposes of the white genocide conspiracy theory, along with many others, is to misdirect attention away from that very question. And liberals, because they largely agree with the white supremacists about Western countries just sort of being better, and Western imperialism not actually being a thing at all, or even being a good thing, are thus unable to contest the conspiracy theory at one of its most important roots. In summary, liberals are unable to critique the capitalist world system and its inevitable results, such as imperialism, because the capitalist world system is their system, and they're not invested in explaining its problems. Rather, they're invested in hiding or denying them, and this renders them impotent when they're faced with some of the most dangerous and widespread right-wing conspiracy theories of today. This is because said conspiracy theories tend to be based on at least some element of truth, often an actually existing problem caused by capitalism, which they then blame on something else entirely, thus diverting attention away from the real cause of this problem. And the sad reality is that, in spite of the tendency of many modern liberals to grandstand as social progressives, diverting attention away from the problems of capitalism tends to suit them just fine, because their priority, above all, is to maintain it. They're not truthfully, deep down, opposed to the right-wing ghouls who hatch these sorts of conspiracies. They're rather dancing with them, as both share the same main concern. That's the end of the video. Make sure to subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this. And if you really like my work, consider supporting me on Patreon and Ko-fi, because without my supporters over there, I could not make this sort of content. Thanks again to Atlas VPN for sponsoring this video. Take advantage of their summer deal for signing up for a free year-long Atlas VPN premium subscription for just $1.83 per month, with 3 months extra thrown in for free, and with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Get all the benefits of Atlas VPN and more for this ridiculously low price. That's all. See you next time. Now I'd just like to thank all of my supporters on Patreon and Ko-fi, and especially my $25 plus supporters: RS, Jel Cribson, Arthur Simac Jones, Milton Friedman, Robocomi, Potte, Ronaldo Alfava, Exos, Stephen Jordan, Aizmalad, Mischief and Fins, William Tomlinson, Brosnan, Ting Ting, and my $10 plus patrons: Ugopnik, Wesley Potts, Nabiru, Justin Bailey 77, Happy Nephron, Ant, Melissa Gomez, Professional Tanky, Minijan, Leaf Fiorine, Johnny Rocket, Sir Splendid, XXXX, JG, Big Man, B, Can't Care Less, Firefox 42, Max Helland, Jack Paul, Mira. That's all. See you next time.